Hi everybody, this is Dina from dinadraws.com, and today I want to share a useful memory device which helps us remember certain ways to get our watercolor to behave consistently. It's a memory device that helps us predict our watercolor's behavior on our page. Is this really possible? Could it be that we can avail ourselves of a crystal ball that will allow us to predict what this uncontrollable and unpredictable medium is going to do next? I don't know if this will always give us perfect insight, but I've found it to be really helpful. So what I call beverage theory goes as follows. We have tea. We have coffee. We have milk, we have cream, and we have what many people refer to as blood. I call it syrup. It's a little more appetizing when we stack it up next to the other categories, don't you think? So what does this mean? Why do we have this list of common, pleasant-to-drink beverages? We use this as a way to gauge the consistency of our watercolor to paint ratio and mix. Let me show you what that looks like. So we control our value in watercolor, as you probably know, through controlling the ratio of paint to water within a wash. So a wash that I would describe as tea looks something like this. This is a weak mixture. It is very predominantly water. It contains a little bit of paint, and it goes on with a light value and a large degree of dilution. So this particular concentration of paint within my wash is one that I would describe as tea, and it's about the consistency and color of weak tea, whichever color you choose to use. So what does coffee look like? Coffee is kind of the next step up the ladder. We get a bit more paint into our wash, and our wash takes on a stronger color, but it's not what I would consider dark, and the color doesn't really become opaque if you're using a more opaque paint. It's a step up in terms of value and concentration from tea. Milk is what I would consider a dark, vivid, pretty intense wash of color. We're going in pretty strong. We want our color to be pretty bright and pretty saturated, but the color is mixed up on the brush. It doesn't have variations of concentration within the wash. Everything is still very uniform. There's enough water in this paint that the wash itself is not favoring streaking or arranging itself into shelving. It's pretty consistent, and there's enough water in this wash to get it to travel, but we start to see a little bit of thickness within our paint. It might cling a bit on our palette or on our brush. That's what I consider a milk consistency of watercolor. Cream takes this yet a step further. So we're looking at having a paint and water mix, again, whatever color you're using, that is starting to really become slow to move across our palette. It really sticks to the brush, and when we apply it, it tends to streak a bit. It's not quite as ready to be flat and uniform within a wash as some of these lower concentrations. So this is about the consistency of, I would say, light cream or half and half, right? Syrup is almost mass tone paint. It is sticky on the brush. It does not want to travel, but it also does want to spread. It's not so mass tone as to be completely dry. So this sticky, almost mass tone concentration of paint is what I call syrup and what some call blood. So these are the different concentrations of paint that we use more or less in the context of painting, and they all have different benefits. They're all really strong and appropriate choices for different painting situations. So you might look at syrup and say to yourself, well, when would I want to use this? When would I want this ugly, streaky wash on my paper? Well, to be fair, very rarely, but we are not always painting on dry paper, as you know. So let's take a look at what happens if I put down some water on my paper. We'll give that a minute to settle. And I'm going to try this with some of these darker, streakier concentrations of paint with my cream and my syrup, but on a wet sheet versus on a dry sheet. So I'll start by putting some of this syrup concentration of paint into this area of wet wash, and we'll just see how that behaves. So we see charging, spreading, and we see granulation where there's a little less water on this wet paper. We see feathering at this edge, and we'll just let this dry and kind of notice the way that it dries. I'm going to increase the water content on my brush a little bit until I have what I would describe as cream. And let's put this across wet paper. Now you see this really beautiful, smooth, consistent fanning and feathering. Let's compare some of this behavior to wetter washes, so to our coffee or our tea washes. So here I've got just a nice, pleasant, middle-of-the-road kind of coffee wash. I'm going to put this into my wet paper. I'm going to remove a whole bunch of my wash from my brush until I have really weak tea. And this is a little more slanted than I would like for my paper to be, but we'll just let that be, let it ride. And I've applied tea to the wet area up here. So what you'll notice is there's a lot more motion, there's a lot more charging. By the time these things dry out, especially on cotton paper, they may overtake the wet area altogether. They may actually dry pretty flat, really close to what we see here. So these stronger concentrations of paint are a great way to maintain these shaped edges, these feathering, fanning, granulating, inconsistent edges, but in a way that is more aesthetically rewarding, a little higher aesthetically valued than perhaps this super streaky appearance on our paper when it's dry. So while this may not prove to be incredibly useful and a consistency that you come back to a lot of the time if you're painting wet on dry, I will let you know that this is probably one of the most commonly used consistencies that I reach for when I am painting into a pre-wet paper or into some kind of wet and wet wash. So one more thing I want to leave you with as food for thought. Keep in mind that the charging, diffusion, dispersion properties of paint vary a lot between color, between manufacturer, between pigment. Even something as seemingly unimportant as manufacturer can matter quite a bit. Here is Paynes Gray in a syrup concentration. The paint that I've been using up to this point is, I believe, a Sennelier paint. It's a phthalo green, but here's M. Graham's Paynes Gray at a syrup concentration going into a wet wash. And I think you'll agree with me that the degree to which this just charges across the page, just kind of explosively works its way through this water, is a little different than some of this behavior. And honestly, to be honest, I can't remember. This might be an M. Graham paint too. So pigment matters, manufacturer matters, all of these different things can be factors in how your paint behaves. But understanding the concentration of paint you're using and reaching for, being able to look back through swatches in your exercise and sketchbooks, and just starting to get used to monitoring the interactions of your paint and your water and finding ways that you can mentally categorize them is going to help you gain control over what seems like an uncontrollable medium. So, you may find this not that helpful. You may be familiar with it. You may be in disagreement with me about how these terms should be defined. Any of those reactions is totally fine. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. But for now, I leave you with tea, coffee, milk, cream, and syrup as ways to mentally categorize the different concentrations of paint and water that go onto your brush. I hope that's helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.